Nearly 70 years have passed since a crafty, silver-tongued gambler first shuffled a deck of cards on an American frontier that had never quite seen his kind before. And the people who built that world around him went on to live lives that were stranger, sadder, and more extraordinary than almost anyone watching in 1957 could have imagined. One of them left the show by suing the studio and won, then became one of the most beloved leading men Hollywood has ever produced. Another was literally forced to dress in a dead man's costume and told to replace a legend, and responded with a line so funny and so desperate that it has never been forgotten. A third became James Bond. A fourth played the doomed murdered wife in one of the most famous television dramas of the 1960s, the good-natured teacher in one of its most beloved family comedies, and the sparkling con woman of the frontier, all at once, and then vanished from screens entirely at the age of 57, leaving behind a gap that nobody has ever quite filled. And the man who created the whole thing was cheated out of his own creation by the studio before the first episode had even aired. Maverick ran on ABC from September 22, 1957 to July 8, 1962, 5 seasons, 124 episodes. A Western built not on courage and gunfire, but on intelligence, irony, and the subtle pleasure of watching a scoundrel outwit a bigger scoundrel. It was unlike anything else on American television at the time, and the people behind it were unlike anyone else in the industry. Number 1, Diane Brewster as Samantha Crawford. She appeared in only 4 episodes. She was never a series regular, never in the opening credits, never a fixture of the weekly schedule. And yet, among everyone who ever appeared on Maverick, Diane Brewster left one of the most lasting impressions of all, because the character she created was so perfectly constructed and so perfectly inhabited that viewers never stopped waiting for her to walk back through the saloon door. Diane Brewster was born on March 11, 1931, in Kansas City, Missouri, and she came from lineage that would have suited her character beautifully had anyone known it. She was a direct descendant of Elder William Brewster, the pilgrim who crossed the Atlantic on the Mayflower, and of Governor William Bradford of Plymouth Colony. The blood of determined and resourceful survivors ran through her family tree for centuries before it reached her. Her father was a trial lawyer. The talent for persuasion, it seems, was hereditary. She studied liberal arts at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, but left after her sophomore year to take a job as a secretary at a radio station. The camera found her afterward, first in small roles and guest appearances, then on the ABC series Cheyenne in 1956, where she played a character called Samantha Crawford for the first time in an episode titled Dark Rider. When Roy Huggins, who was creating Maverick at Warner Brothers, saw that performance, he made a decision. Samantha Crawford, whose name, according to Huggins himself, was borrowed from his own mother's maiden name, would come to the frontier. She was 26 years old when Maverick premiered in September 1957. 3 episodes into the first season, Samantha Crawford arrived in the episode According to Hoyle, a gorgeous card-sharp con artist with a faint southern accent she deployed like a weapon, a smile that promised everything and a mind that calculated everything, and a peculiar, genuine affection for Bret Maverick that made the two of them feel like mirror images of each other. She returned in The Seventh Hand with Garner, The Savage Hills with Jack Kelly, and in the celebrated two-brother episode Shady Deal at Sunny Acres, each appearance earning her a slightly more devoted following than the one before. What nobody watching could have known was that she would be gone from the character entirely by 1958, not by choice, not by firing, but simply because she moved on to other things, and the show moved on with her. Those other things proved to be remarkable. While she was playing Samantha Crawford on Maverick, she was simultaneously appearing as Miss Canfield, the warm and gentle second-grade teacher on Leave It to Beaver. The distance between those two roles, the sparkling frontier schemer and the gentle grade school instructor, was as wide as American television could offer, and Brewster handled both with complete conviction. Later, she appeared in 2 episodes of The Fugitive as Helen Kimball, the murdered wife of Richard Kimball, the wrongfully convicted man, played by David Jansen. The part was small in terms of screen time. She appeared only in flashbacks in a single dream sequence, but it was central to the entire emotional structure of that series. Her face, her warmth, and the shadow of her death haunted every episode of The Fugitive for 4 years, even after she had stopped appearing. She married an oral surgeon named Dr. Jabi Walker in May 1959. They had 2 children and settled in Studio City, California. Her last television appearance came in 1988. 3 years later, on November 12, 1991, Diane Brewster died of sudden heart failure at her home in Studio City. She was 60 years old. Her ashes were scattered at sea, per her own wishes. A footnote that contains multitudes. When the 1994 theatrical film version of Maverick was made, with Mel Gibson in the lead, Jodie Foster's character, the sharp, clever, beautiful con woman who runs circles around everyone, was built directly on the template Diane Brewster had created nearly 40 years earlier. Brewster never got credit for it, and she was already gone by the time the film was released. Number 2. Robert Colbert as Bret Maverick. The story of Robert Colbert on Maverick is, in its way, one of the funniest and saddest stories in the history of television casting. And the line he delivered when he understood what the studio was asking of him is possibly the most honest thing any actor has ever said to a producer. Robert Louis Colbert was born on July 26, 1931, in Long Beach, California. His early life gave no obvious indication of where he would end up. He was athletic. He excelled in track at Long Beach Polytechnic High School and studied theater arts at the University of California, Berkeley. But nothing about his path suggested that he would one day be dressed in another man's clothes and told to become him. He served in the United States Army, stationed on the Japanese island of Okinawa, where he worked as a clerk typist with a military police unit and moonlighted as a disc jockey at radio station KSBK. A woman with the Air Force Special Services heard his voice on the air one evening and recruited him to act in a production of The Caine Mutiny Court-Martial. He was 26, thousands of miles from home, and acting had found him entirely by accident. He returned to the United States, performed on stage in Portland, and caught the attention of a talent agency that brought him to Warner Brothers. He was 26 when he signed his contract in 1957. For the next several years, he guest starred across the entire Warner Brothers television stable: 77 Sunset Strip, Hawaiian Eye, Bronco, Bourbon Street Beat, and many others, building a steady reputation as a reliable, handsome, physically impressive performer. He first appeared on Maverick in the 4th season as a character called Cherokee Dan Evans. Then came the moment that would define how he was remembered. James Garner had left the show. Roger Moore was about to leave. The studio was in crisis. They looked at Robert Colbert, who stood 6'1", had dark features, and bore a resemblance to James Garner that was impossible to ignore, and made their decision. They would dress him in Garner's costumes. They would give him Garner's character. They would call him Bret Maverick, a brother nobody had ever mentioned, and trust that audiences would accept the substitution. Colbert was 30 years old when this was proposed to him. He was under contract, which meant he had no real choice, but he expressed his feelings about the situation with perfect clarity. "Put me in a dress and call me Brenda," he told the producers, "but don't do this to me." They did it anyway. He appeared as Bret Maverick in exactly 2 episodes: The Forbidden City, which aired on March 26, 1961, and Benefit of the Doubt, which aired on April 9th of the same year, and was not called back for the 5th season. The ratings were declining, the energy was gone, and no amount of costuming could recreate what Garner had built. Colbert was 30 when those episodes aired. He was never given enough screen time to prove whether he could have carried the show or not, and that unanswered question has followed the series into history. What followed was genuinely interesting in its own right. Colbert's agent arranged a meeting with science fiction producer Irwin Allen, and in 1966, Colbert landed the lead role of Dr. Doug Phillips in The Time Tunnel, Allen's ambitious, visually spectacular series about 2 physicists trapped in a time travel device who bounce uncontrollably through history, landing in famous events they can never quite change. The show ran for 30 episodes on ABC in 1966 and 1967, was canceled due to high production costs, and became a cult classic that kept Colbert's face in the memory of science fiction fans for decades. He continued to work in television through the 1970s and into the 1990s, with his final regular role on The Young and the Restless. He married dancer and choreographer Dottie Harmony, and they had children together. Dottie passed away in 2023. Robert Colbert, who turned 94 in July 2025, is still with us in 2026. The man they dressed in another man's clothes outlasted them all. Number 3. Roger Moore as Bo Maverick. He arrived to fill a gap that was essentially impossible to fill, did so with more grace and wit than almost anyone had a right to expect, and then departed on his own terms, which, as it turned out, was a preview of exactly how he would conduct the rest of his remarkable life. Roger George Moore was born on October 14, 1927, in Stockwell, a working-class neighborhood in South London. His father was a local policeman. His mother had been born in Calcutta, India, to a British family. He was an only child. The war came when he was 12, and he was evacuated from London to Devon, one of hundreds of thousands of children separated from their parents during the Blitz, carried into the countryside to wait out the bombing. When the war was over and he came home, he enrolled briefly in what would become the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, where one of his classmates was Lois Maxwell, the actress who would later play Miss Moneypenny in the Bond films. He left RADA after only 6 months in order to find work as a paid actor. His earliest roles were as a male model, appearing in advertisements for knitwear and toothpaste. He was 29 years old when Maverick premiered. Moore first appeared on the show 2 seasons before he became Bo Maverick, in an episode that retooled Richard Brinsley Sheridan's 1775 comedy, The Rivals, in which he played a character who bet Garner's Bret Maverick that he could pass himself off as the famous gambler, and spent most of the episode identifying himself as Bret Maverick. In a sense, the joke was already pointing toward what came next. When James Garner left the show after winning his lawsuit against Warner Brothers, the studio turned to Moore, who was already under contract for The Alaskans, a series that had been quietly recycling Maverick scripts with different names and locations, meaning that Moore had already delivered many of Garner's lines in a different context. He became Bo Maverick, the English-accented cousin who had grown up across the Atlantic and brought a faintly aristocratic air to the frontier. In the 4th season premiere, The Bundle from Britain, he was 33 years old at the time. He appeared in 14 episodes, occasionally sharing the screen with Jack Kelly, and brought his own unmistakable quality to the role. An elegant lightness, a raised eyebrow where Garner would have deployed a half grin, a sense that everything was slightly absurd and that this was, in fact, the correct response. He even took to wearing some of Garner's actual costumes, which the producers had conveniently kept around. He quit after 1 season, citing a decline in script quality since the Garner era. He was characteristically polite about it, and characteristically honest. He had never needed to resort to legal measures, as Garner had. He simply found the scripts insufficient and left. What he walked toward was extraordinary. The Saint, the long-running British series in which he played Simon Templar from 1962 to 1969, made him internationally famous. And then came Bond. 7 films from Live and Let Die in 1973 to A View to a Kill in 1985. More appearances as 007 than any other actor before or since. He received his knighthood in 2003. He served as a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador for the last 2 decades of his life, raising funds for children's causes with the same effortless warmth he had brought to every character he had ever played. Sir Roger Moore died on May 23, 2017, in Switzerland after a short battle with cancer. He was 89 years old. He had often said that he was one lucky bastard, a self-assessment that was simultaneously too modest and completely accurate. The man who briefly filled the gap, left by James Garner, went on to become one of the most recognizable figures in 20th century popular entertainment. Number 4. Jack Kelly as Bart Maverick. He appeared in more episodes than James Garner. He was on screen from the first season to the very last. He stayed for every season when others left. He was, by any mathematical measure, the backbone of Maverick. And yet, history has been stubbornly reluctant to give him the credit that mathematics demands. That peculiarity haunted him in life and followed him beyond it. Jack Kelly was born John Augustus Kelly, Jr. on September 16, 1927, in Astoria, Queens, New York City, into a family that was theatrical at its very core. His mother was a stage actress and model. His father was a theater ticket broker. He began appearing in soap advertisements at the age of 2. earning, by all accounts, a lifetime supply of soap as his payment. By the time he was 9, he was performing in his first stage play. Broadway shows and radio followed. When the family relocated to California in 1938, he attended John's Military Academy and spent 2 years as a law student at UCLA, dropping acting entirely for a period to focus on school and on making money in more practical ways, working as a shoe salesman, gas station attendant, lifeguard, and men's clothing salesman, among other occupations. He was inducted into the Army in 1945, sent to Alaska as a weather observer, and was among the first crew on a B-29 to fly over the Arctic Circle, a genuinely extraordinary footnote in the life of a man who would go on to spend 6 years on the American frontier. After his military service, he returned to UCLA, worked radio programs at night, and gradually rebuilt his acting career. In 1955, Warner Brothers signed him to play Dr. Paris Mitchell in the Kings Row segment of Warner Brothers' Presence. He was 30 years old when Maverick premiered in September 1957. He was not in the first episode. He was not in the second, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth, or the sixth, or the seventh. He entered the show in episode 8, Hostage, as Bart Maverick, Bret's newly revealed brother. The reason he existed at all was logistical. Each episode was taking more than a week to produce, and the studio was going to run out of finished episodes before the season ended. They needed a second production unit and a second Maverick to justify it. In the script for Hostage, to generate immediate audience sympathy for the new character, Bart was tied up and beaten by a corrupt police officer within the first act. It worked. Kelly's physicality, his deep voice, his John Barrymore-like profile, and a kind of grounded earthiness that complemented Garner's lightness made the pairing feel organic rather than manufactured. The two brothers became the best version of each other. In the celebrated Shady Deal at Sunny Acres episode, in which Bret spends the entire story sitting in a rocking chair, whittling, while everyone assumes he is doing nothing, and Bart is doing the actual work. In the Pappy episode, in which Garner played both Bret and their father, Beauregard Maverick, through trick photography, and Kelly played both Bart and elderly Uncle Bentley in Duel at Sundown, in which Garner fist-fought guest star Clint Eastwood, and Bart arrived to rescue him. A detail that tells the whole story. In the scripts, the two brothers were designated Maverick 1 and Maverick 2, and Garner, by seniority, always had first choice of which he played. Garner left after season 3. Moore came and went. Colbert came and went. And Kelly remained, alone in the 5th season, carrying the show with no partner and declining scripts, alternating new episodes with reruns from the Garner era. He appeared in 83 episodes in total, to Garner's 64. He was 35 years old when the show ended in July 1962. His sister was Nancy Kelly, the Academy Award-nominated actress. His political views were conservative Republican, Garner's were liberal Democrat, and by every account, they were close friends for 35 years, which is itself a kind of statement about what the show was capable of producing. After Maverick, Kelly's career never reached those heights again. He worked steadily, guest appearances, supporting roles, the occasional reunion project, but nothing anchored him the way Bart Maverick had. In the 1980s, he made a surprising pivot. He ran for city council in Huntington Beach, California, with the campaign slogan, "Let Maverick solve your problems," and won. He served 2 4-year terms on the council and held the rotating position of mayor twice during the 1983 to 1986 period. He was midway through a 3rd council term when, on April 28, 1992, he suffered a heart attack. 6 months later, on November 7, 1992, Jack Kelly died of a stroke at Humana Hospital in Huntington Beach. He was 65 years old. He had outlasted the show by 30 years, entered politics, and still never quite escaped the shadow of a man who had left after 3 seasons. Number 5. James Garner as Bret Maverick. He was born James Scott Bumgarner on April 7, 1928, in Norman, Oklahoma, and almost nothing about his early life suggested that he would become one of the most natural, effortlessly charismatic performers in the history of American entertainment. His mother, Mildred, who was part Cherokee, died when he was 4 years old. His father, a carpet layer, eventually left James and his two brothers in the care of relatives. The boy grew up in the Great Depression-era Dust Bowl with very little, bounced between relatives, dropped out of high school at 16 to join the Merchant Marines, and went on to serve in the Korean War, where he was wounded twice and awarded 2 Purple Hearts. He was not trained as an actor. He had never studied the craft. He was, by his own account, simply a man who had survived enough that pretending came naturally. His entry into acting was almost casual. A friend got him a non-speaking role in the Broadway production of The Caine Mutiny Court-Martial in 1954. His job was to read lines to the lead actors during rehearsals, which meant that he spent months watching Henry Fonda work and absorbing, without being entirely aware of it, how a great performer inhabits a role. Small television parts followed. A Warner Brothers contract followed that. In 1957, he appeared in the film Sayonara alongside Marlon Brando. That same year, a television producer named Roy Huggins saw him delivering poker player dialogue in a minor episode of an anthology series called Conflict. Noticed that he got laughs in places where the writing hadn't asked for them, and decided to build a Western around exactly that quality. He was 29 years old when Maverick premiered on September 22, 1957. What Garner did with Bret Maverick was, in retrospect, genuinely innovative. The Western hero of American television in 1957 was brave, self-reliant, physically formidable, and earnest. Bret Maverick was none of these things, or rather, he was all of these things while refusing to admit it. He claimed to be a coward. He claimed to be motivated entirely by money. He preferred to win with a card trick rather than a gunfight. And he preferred a gunfight to any situation that was actually dangerous. His father, whom he quoted constantly, "My old pappy used to say," had apparently spent a lifetime teaching him to avoid honest work. And yet, at the end of almost every episode, it was Bret who had done the right thing, usually without quite meaning to. The comedy and the heroism were inseparable, and Garner delivered both with a precision that looked effortless because it was, in some fundamental way, simply who he was. The show beat The Ed Sullivan Show and The Steve Allen Show in the ratings, which was, at that moment in American television, roughly the equivalent of a new restaurant outselling both McDonald's and Burger King simultaneously. It ran for 3 seasons before Garner did something unusual for an actor of his era. He sued the studio. During a writer's strike in 1960, Warner Brothers had suspended him without pay, claiming they had no scripts to work with. He went to court. It turned out the studio had been actively commissioning scripts throughout the strike. He won. He was 32 years old, walking away from the most successful role of his career, and he was completely right to do it. What he walked toward was extraordinary. The Great Escape in 1963, opposite Steve McQueen, in which Garner's character was the forgery specialist, the man who could manufacture documents and identities, which was essentially just Bret Maverick applied to a prisoner of war camp. The Americanization of Emily in 1964, which gave him a role that was more complex and more interesting than almost anything he had attempted. Grand Prix in 1966, for which he actually trained as a racing driver and competed at genuine speed in genuine Formula One cars. And then, years later, The Rockford Files, where Jim Rockford, a private detective living in a trailer on Malibu Beach, was recognizably Bret Maverick with a telephone and a filing cabinet, wishing he were somewhere else, and somehow always ending up doing the right thing. 6 seasons, an Emmy Award, the show of his life. His personal life was marked by one extraordinary constant. He met Lois Clark in 1956 and married her 2 weeks later. They remained married for 58 years. He adopted her daughter from a previous relationship, and the couple had a daughter together named Gigi. In 1988, he underwent quintuple bypass surgery. In 2008, he suffered a stroke. His daughter Gigi later said of him, "My father was an all-around good guy and a big animal lover. He was just a genuine person who lived by the golden rule." James Garner died on July 19, 2014, at his home in Brentwood, Los Angeles, of a heart attack. He was 86 years old. He had been given a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1960. In the town of Norman, Oklahoma, where he was born, a 3-meter bronze statue of Bret Maverick was erected in his honor. A figure in a gambler's coat, holding cards, looking entirely relaxed about the whole thing. Clint Eastwood, who who guest starred on Maverick and later worked with Garner on Space Cowboys, said it most directly. Garner opened the door for people like Steve McQueen and myself. That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment. The man from Norman, Oklahoma, who claimed he couldn't act, who said he was doing it for the money, who sued a studio and won, opened the door for two of the most iconic figures of 20th century American cinema. He did it by being exactly who he was. Number 6. Roy Huggins, the man behind the curtain. He was never on screen. He was never in the opening credits the way an actor is. But nothing about Maverick would have existed without Roy Huggins. And the story of what Warner Brothers did to him before the show had even aired is one of the more instructive episodes in the history of television production. Roy Marshall Huggins was born on July 18, 1914, in a small town in Washington state. He graduated summa cum laude from UCLA, began a doctoral program in political science, and abandoned it when the war came. He wrote novels, The Double Take, Too Late for Tears, and when Columbia Pictures bought the rights to his work, he transitioned into screenwriting. He directed a Randolph Scott Western in 1952. He joined the Communist Party briefly in the 1930s because of his opposition to fascism, resigned after the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, and was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1952. He named names, specifically people who had already been named by others, and 3 who had not, and the decision followed him for the rest of his life in ways both professional and personal. In 1955, Warner Brothers hired him as a television producer. He created Cheyenne, he developed 77 Sunset Strip, and then he created Maverick. He was 43 years old when the show premiered. He had cast James Garner based on watching him deliver poker player dialogue with a completely natural comedic rhythm that the writing hadn't asked for. He had conceived the central idea, a Western hero who refused the standard heroic posture, who was honest about his own cowardice, whose moral code was real but never announced. Huggins spent his later career demanding and receiving increasing ownership of his creative work, writing under pseudonyms that were composites of his sons' names, and winning the contractual battles that he had lost to Warner Brothers. He died on April 3, 2002, in Santa Monica, California, at the age of 87. He had created 4 of the most enduring television series in American broadcast history: Maverick, 77 Sunset Strip, The Fugitive, and The Rockford Files, and had seen all of them outlive the studio that had tried to take them from him. Number 7. Jack Kelly's Political Turn, a postscript worth its own entry. It bears returning to something that has not been sufficiently examined: the image of Jack Kelly, who had spent 6 years playing an itinerant frontier gambler, standing before the Huntington Beach City Council in a suit and tie and saying, perfectly straight-faced, "Let Maverick solve your problems." The voters of Huntington Beach, California, said yes, twice, then a third time. He advocated for affordable housing. He questioned development proposals and negotiated their terms. He brought Hollywood metaphors to council proceedings, with a relish that the local press found alternately charming and exasperating. He was, by all accounts, genuinely engaged with the work, not doing it as a lark or a late-career vanity project, but because the city he lived in mattered to him, and he believed he could help. He was a conservative Republican who had been close friends with the liberal Democrat James Garner for 35 years, which tells you something about both men that their public personas alone do not. He was midway through his 3rd council term when the heart attack came in April 1992. 6 months later, the stroke. He was 65. The man who played the character described in television history as the second Maverick was, in the last decade of his life, a working politician in a California beach city, which is either the most improbable ending to a TV Western career ever recorded, or the most perfectly Maverick one imaginable. They were all, in their different ways, variations on the character the show had created. People who moved through a world that didn't quite have a category for them, who claimed to be motivated by money or comfort or self-interest, and who somehow ended up doing the right thing. James Garner sued a studio and won, and then spent the rest of his life being exactly who he was. Jack Kelly stayed for the whole run, went into politics, and never stopped believing that Maverick's particular brand of practical intelligence had something to offer the world. Roger Moore turned a temporary assignment into a lifetime of playing elegant men under pressure, and spent his later years working for children who had nothing. Diane Brewster created a character so resonant that a filmmaker was still borrowing from her 40 years later, and vanished quietly before anyone got the chance to thank her properly. Robert Colbert said the funniest and most honest thing anyone has ever said to a television producer, wore a dead man's costume, played 2 episodes, and outlived them all. And Roy Huggins, who invented the whole thing, was cheated out of his credit before a single frame had aired, and went on to create 3 more landmarks of American television. A story about how 5 seasons of a Western, built on poker, irony, and deliberate unheroism, produced lives that were, in the end, far more extraordinary than anything the frontier ever offered. Tell us in the comments, which of these stories surprised you most, and which Maverick, Bret, Bart, Bo, or Brent was your favorite. If you want to keep finding the real stories behind the classic shows and the people who made them, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell. Every week, we go past the legend and into the life.